are there. Okay? I'm assuming everybody can hear this, all right? All right. My error last time, the last lecture, I forgot at the very end to make a sort of one-sentence statement about what is the conservation message today about this lecture that I gave to you, which was based on natural history and biology and field ecology from the 1960s. Okay, that's a long time ago. That's 50 plus years ago. So what is the conservation message now with respect to that bit of natural history, aside from the natural history itself? The message now, today, is that this is what it all looks like. It's all gone. That is a sugarcane field from which your sugar that you ate today and yesterday and the day before in the United States was derived. It's a Costa Rican sugarcane field. The area where I did all my thesis research, all that biology in Veracruz, Mexico, today is completely gone. All sugarcane. The houses are gone, the people are gone, the biology is gone, everything is gone. That frontier farming system, which was actually moderately sustainable for those people at a very low level of economics, is completely gone and replaced by industrial agriculture, which is generating sugar, of course, from Mexico, but an enormous amount of sugar for the international trade as well. That conservation message that is what's happening all over the tropics, not just in Veracruz, not just in where we live in Costa Rica, but everywhere. So those kinds of stories, those kinds of biology are literally being eaten by humanity. So that's the conservation message from last time. Okay. Now, for today, we're going a totally different direction. We're going in the direction of plant chemistry, of plant flavors, of plant tastes, why they have what they have. This is a quote from Winnie the Pooh, a child's book, which some of you may have read when you were children. I hope you do now as an adult, because there's a lot of message in that book. And it's called Winnie the Pooh. And this is a donkey standing out in a field, and this is his opinion about the food that he has to eat. Now, these slides are made by me 30 years ago. This is the way we made slides in those days. And the message is the same, and the message will still be the same 100 years from now. So I don't worry about casting the slide in fancy formal terms. But the bottom line here is that all plants have defenses against the things who eat them, all of them. Different defenses, different plants, but they all have defenses. If they didn't, they wouldn't be there anymore. The second statement is that what is toxic to one thing who eats plants is in fact something that another beast eats it because it wants that material. Okay. The third one is that every defense that a plant has is breached by someone. And if it wasn't, the world would be 10 feet deep in that defense. The whole point is that somebody is able to get through any defense that a plant comes up with, but not all. The final one is that you may hear about an animal or an insect or a fungus or whatever eating a plant named by a species. That's invariably a little bit false, because usually the herbivore does not eat the whole species. it eats some piece of the species. Because Latin binomials are the names, all right? That's the scientific name. But the herbivores usually feed on the piece of the plant that, in fact, is edible to them or tolerable to them in one way or another. And finally, every kind of food that an animal can eat has some satiation level. In other words, it's not that it can get, well, it can get too much, but it doesn't normally do that. But the point is that it's got some level of which it can't eat anymore because it's satiated. Either its ability to deal with a toxin is overloaded, or it's just eaten too much of that particular thing and has to move on to some other thing. We're going to deal with details for all of these things as we go on, but these are the generalities that are behind the chemistry and the reality of what plants have in them. Now, this castle is a drawing from the 1500s in France, illustrating all the different things attacking a castle at the same time. In other words, a plant is a castle. It can't move. It can't go away. So the fungi, the mammals, the insects, whatever, the mites, the nematodes, whatever the things are out there, all of them are attacking the castle. All of them are attacking the plant. Some of them will be able to get through its defenses. Many will not be able to. But every plant is dealing with a whole array of things, not any one particular kind of thing. But as scientists, we tend to pick out one particular thing and focus on that to understand it. First, let's take a glance at physical defenses, of which they're really pretty boring. And this is the one that's very prominent. This is my arm with a mosquito feeding on it. And the physical defenses, in this case, my defenses against that mosquito are simply this. In other words, this is not really chemistry in a direct sense other than indirectly, because my defense was to feel the itching from that mosquito and therefore reach over and swat it. Okay, so that is a kind of defense, of course, but it's not a chemical defense that I'm referring to with respect to plants. A turtle is mechanically defended. Well, that's pretty obvious, I think. An oyster is also hard shell. Now, of course, that hard shell is created by chemistry, but it's not really toxic in some sense, just like the turtle shell is not toxic to some animal who would eat it. And furthermore, once you go on to these kinds of physical defenses, the way of getting around them tends to be pretty mechanical as well. So this is a lion in this case, and it simply crunches through some kind of a solid physical defense. And finally, animals like snakes eat the whole animal whole. They don't chew it up. They swallow it and digest the animal. So in a certain sense, there isn't chemistry for that digestion. That's true. But that's not how they're getting around the defenses of the animal that they eat. They simply swallow it, suffocate it, constrict it before they swallow it. They do not chew up their food. The porcupine has another kind of physical defense. This is a roadkill in Wyoming. And as you can see what its defenses are, I don't think that requires a lot of explanation. A cactus also is defended by physical things. But when you see a cactus that looks like this, what you know is it probably doesn't have spectacular chemical defenses inside. But many of you have heard of peyote, the cactus source for LSD, and it does not have spines. In other words, animals don't eat it. Why? Because they can't handle the dose of LSD. So the cactus defense of the peyote cactus is a chemistry, whereas most cacti are defended by spines like this. Now, this is an acacia branch that you've seen before, not the same species, but another one. And this is one who, if we came up to that branch now, today, would not have these spines. But if we've gone by before and trimmed off the leaves, when it grew a new branch, it grows the leaves. So the defenses for the physical thing are in the genome, but not expressed all the time. And this is something that chemistry works, it does as well. We'll get to that in a bit. And finally, the spines don't always work. This is an elephant eating an acacia. And those green leaves, the green stems and branches you see there are very thorny. But the elephant, if you ever have a chance with a happy elephant in a zoo or other place where you can stick your hand inside its mouth and feel the palate of this thing, it's got a palate, a dorsal part of its mouth that feels like a washboard, hard as a rock, and it's made of cartilage and tissue, but it's living tissue, but he can crunch it up against that with his end of his tongue and with his molars, from the lower molars up against the palate, and literally crush its way through a mechanical defense like thorns. But this elephant will not eat many plants that are chemically defended. So now let's go to move over to the chemistry side of things. And remember from the acacia ants, they had thorns, which had some defense against the mammal. They have behavior called the ants. But where's the chemistry? It turns out that when you take those leaves from an ant acacia and you give them to a chemist to ask him what are the chemical defenses, he comes back to you and says basically none. It's lettuce, as in, a crop plant that we have bred the chemistry out of. Well, the biology of the ant interaction with the acacia has equally bred the chemistry out. So the plant is putting its resources into making the ants and the thorns and the nectaries and staying green in the dry season, rather than making nasty chemicals that keep this thing from being uneaten. Okay? So now let's look at the chemical defenses, which are much, much more widespread and much more involved with people as well over time. The one that you know best is cellulose, just what you call wood. That is nothing more than sugar. It's a sugar molecule with a slight difference in the adjustment of the organization of the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen parts of the sugar molecule. So it's very cheap to make. Does not involve proteins, does not involve fancy other enzymes, and the plants can, and this obviously would have been one of the very first chemical defenses made by land plants as they moved out of the ocean up on land where anybody could then chew on them. So the beautiful thing about cellulose is it's very cheap, it's simple sugar, ordinary chemistry, and the one other side of the coin is that the plant itself cannot digest it. And you cannot digest it. No animal can digest cellulose. So why isn't the world 80 feet deep in cellulose? Because fungi and bacteria can digest it. But animals, termites, ants, cows, horses, none of them can digest cellulose. So what they do is they eat plants with all its cellulose to feed the compost heap in their own guts, which is doing the digesting. So the cow really isn't digesting cellulose. What's digesting cellulose is this microbiota living inside of it. Now, moving past that very simple one, we get into a long list of very different things, many of which are very well known to the organic chemistry world. In fact, the organic chemistry world is by and large based on these other things. And up until the early, let's say, World War II, the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, these were viewed as waste products. Plants full of them, and they were viewed by the organic chemistry world and biology in general as being plant shit and urine. In other words, leftover, the remainders of their other metabolic. So they were called secondary compounds, not primary compounds. You know, primary compounds are sugars and proteins and fats and these things. These things were all called secondary compounds, and the focus was on what are they in a sense of chemistry sense rather than what function do they play for the plant. Okay. More recently, in the 60s and 70s, they got to be called allelopathy, which is just a fancy word for strange chemicals, different chemicals. And finally, today, they're called more honestly chemical defenses because they mostly are. Some of them are attractants as well, but often they are defenses. Now, this list here is just a partial list. If you were to go on Google and put those words in one at a time, you get all kinds of details about which one is which. Now, let me just mention a couple of examples here. A lectin, oh, yes, just a minute. A lectin, up here at the top, is a protein which selectively binds onto proteins in your gut, the wall of your gut, blood vessels, these kinds of things, and renders them indigestible or damages them. So it's when you eat things that are rich in lectins, you get a gut ache. And a perfect example of that is if you get black beans from the grocery store, dried black beans from the grocery store, grind them up, put them in water, and swallow it, you will get a gut ache. Why? Because that black bean is full of 50%, 60% lectins, which are the proteins stored for the juvenile seedling, and they're the defenses of that seed, the black bean, against mice and insects. So the protein that's in there is doing double duty. It's defense, and also it's part of the bag lunch for the juvenating seedling. Alkaloids, you know very well. They're things like nicotine in cigarettes, morphine, cocaine. These are all alkaloids, and they do all kinds of nasty things when they get into your metabolic system. And they're small molecules. They go right through your gut wall into the blood. They go up through your system to your liver. Your liver chops them up into pieces as its own defenses, and then the pieces are passed on through the blood to your kidneys, and you urinate them out. That's the way you get rid of alkaloids if you haven't been poisoned by them in the first place. The other thing about alkaloids is that they are made in an enormous number of kinds. So the lectins are not too many kinds, maybe thousands of them, but alkaloids are tens of thousands of kinds. Cyanogenic glycosides are molecules where they have a cyanide molecule attached to a sugar molecule. So in the plant, these two bound up pieces don't damage the plant. But when you eat the plant, and a perfect example of this is a raw wild lima bean. When you eat the plant, the cyanogenic glycoside goes into your blood, goes from your blood into your liver. Your liver strips off the sugar molecule as part of its so-called degrading it, and the cyanide then goes to work on your red blood cells, and you end up being basically suffocated. There's a thing here called an uncommon amino acid right there. The uncommon amino acids are, regular amino acids, and like 23 of them or so that make up your proteins. Well, there are thousands of slight variations on those amino acids in your proteins that are toxic because your system cannot distinguish between them and the lookalike regular amino acid. So it puts this uncommon amino acid in the same place in a protein that the regular ones do, and then the protein doesn't function. So as we go on down the line, there are more of these kinds. I'm not going to take the time here to run through them one by one, but I want to show you some examples of these. One that you know very well, or you've heard of, certainly, is marijuana. And the compound itself is tetrahydrocannabinol, which is basically an alcohol, but not a drinking alcohol. This is a scanning electron microscope surface of the plant that has of a pot plant, and the tetrahydrocannabinol is in these vacuoles. You see little circle things here, like little bubbles on the surface of the plant. That's where the actual active ingredient is. And for example, in this particular case, if you, as all good plant growers know, if you take the seeds and you plant the seedling in heavy shade so that it doesn't have much energy, it turns into a male, and the male has very little active tetrahydrocannabinol in it, because that's an expensive defense. If you put it in the sun, it has a lot of energy, it turns into a female, and with that energy, it not only turns into a female, but it makes flowers, it makes fruits, it makes seeds, and the high concentration of tetrahydrocannabinol is, surprise, surprise, on the sexual parts of the plant. The flowers, the stems, the fruits, the leaf pieces in the vicinity of that, those are where the high concentration is, because that's the most important part of the plant not to be eaten by an herbivore. What does tetrahydrocannabinol do? I won't have an opinion about it about humans, but I can say that it sterilizes insects. This is a blister on my arm from a poison ivy plant. And what it's doing is the compound is called anacardic acid. It's in the surface of a poison ivy plant, and you brush it, and it comes off on your skin, and then that compound there damages your skin and creates a big blister like this. Okay. Hemlock is perhaps known to you. This is what Socrates committed suicide with. It's a European small weed with a very toxic compound called conium. This is an alkaloid in it. And the common name for the plant is hemlock. And all it takes is a cup of tea from this to kill a person. So and basically the person goes unconscious. So it's a gentle way of committing suicide. This one you all know very well. These are coffee berries, and inside of there is a seed, fairly large seed, a coffee seed that you know about from the grocery store. And the fruit is eaten by mammals as dispersing the fruit, but nobody eats the seeds. Excuse me, no, mammals eat the seeds because they're very toxic. Why? Because they're full of caffeine. And caffeine is definitely a toxin for small animals. It is for you too, of course, if you eat too much of it. These have been known since time immemorial. The original use of the coffee bean seed was to put it between your high molars and chew it while you're doing hard work. And that gives a steady dribble of a small amount of caffeine into your system, which is the same as drinking small amounts of coffee. Keep you awake and keep you alert. It's a stimulant, in other words, but it's the defense of that seed inside the coffee. This is a tea orchard, and what the tea plant is doing is makes all these new leaves that you can see here on the surface of this. These have been all sprayed with herbicide to knock off the old leaf crop, and now it makes a new leaf crop there. And the brand new, very tender young leaves are where the high concentration of the alkaloid called theine, very similar to caffeine, is in those new leaves, which is, of course, the most important part of the plant, to the plant. And they're picked by hand and dried, and so you make tea out of it. The yellow that you see in this field is being hand-picked by Mexican laborers in northern Mexico. And this is in India here. This is in northern Mexico. And what they're picking are these yellow flowers that you see out here, the entire field. Now, when you go to the grocery store, go to the place where they sell cans of pressurized pesticide for you to kill the cockroaches and the ants in your kitchen. Take the can and read the back small fine print, and you will see that it says 0.1% pyrethrum, this compound right here. This is a secondary compound in the yellow flowers right here. And that's harvested, dried, concentrated, and here's a bag of pyrethrum flowers here. And that bag full then gets concentrated, the compound taken out, and put into the pesticide that you put in your kitchen, because mammals are not affected by pyrethrum. But insects are knocked down, paralyzed, but not killed. So you see the cockroach, the wasp, the ant in your kitchen, you spray it with a pyrethrum, it falls over in an instant. So you say, wow, how effective the pesticide. But that was a quick knockdown compound, and then the people who make the pesticide add to it synthetic pesticides, which are slower acting but kill. Now here's a field one out here on the roadside in Pennsylvania and many other places. It's called milkweed, a little herbaceous plant. If you break the leaf, out comes a white latex. You see right there, that patch from the bent over folded leaf. That latex is full of a compound called a cardiac glycoside. Now in the year 1800s, you fell over with a heart attack if there was a knowledgeable medicine man or a knowledgeable medical guy nearby and he had the stuff with him. This was a homemade remedy to feed you a spoonful of that, and it would make your heart beat very fast. So you're either dead or your heart comes back to functioning after your heart attack. And so it's well known as a cardiac glycoside. So the active compound is bound to a sugar molecule in this thing, but your gut strips off the sugar and lets this thing go into your bloodstream and da-da-da-da-da. Okay. So here's how it works in nature. This is a horse pasture on the right-hand side of this fence and no horses on the left-hand side of the fence. Okay. Now let's look closely at this pasture over here on the right-hand side. And what you see is basically no grass, but all these milkweed plants. What that's saying to you is the horse absolutely will not touch those milkweed plants, no matter how hungry it is. In other words, it's eating all its food down to nothing. Now we go over to the other side of the fence, and here's the grass that the horse would eat, and then here's the milkweed plants scattered throughout. So you turn the big herbivore loose in this pasture, he runs around, eats all the grass, and doesn't touch the milkweed plants. So you can see what the value of that is to a world that has big herbivores like deer and horses and moose and cows, those kinds of things. Well, along with that plant are bugs like this one. And these guys are penetrating the plant into the sap vessels inside. They have acquired the cardiac glycosides from the plant, and selection has turned them bright red. That says to the bird, do not touch. There's another one, a different beetle, doing the same thing. And here's the kids from that beetle. Brand new, bright red, basically. Mom, bird, period, male or female, won't touch those things because it makes them vomit violently, which I'll show you in a later lecture. When it gets a cardiac glycoside inside his gut, as would you. In other words, you can only tolerate a very small dose. Okay? This beetle is very interesting. Its larva eats the roots of milkweed, and the roots do not have the cardiac glycoside. Just like I said earlier that a herbivore does not necessarily eat the Latin binomial, this beetle does not this beetle eats milkweed plants, yes, but its larva feeds on the roots, so it can't sequester the cardiac glycoside. But when the adult emerges from the pupa, it goes up on the leaf and eats a small hole. And from that small hole, it acquires the cardiac glycoside not to turn it red. It's already, genome says red, but it makes this a real defendant animal rather than a mimic. Because the mimic would have nothing to back up its red color. This is a mimic. This is feeding on the milkweed flowers, which do not have cardiac glycosides. And its genome says red and black, but that's been selected for as a mimic. And we'll talk quite a bit more about mimicry later on. Okay? But that is a mimic because it doesn't have any defenses other than fooling the bird into saying, no, don't touch it. This is a ladybird beetle who does the same thing, but nowhere near the milkweed at all. It makes its own defensive chemicals. It's not getting them from the plant. It's making it itself. So it's toxic also, and warningly colored also, but not acquiring them from the plant. This is a caterpillar of the monarch butterfly who acquires them from the plant. And notice here's the leaf, and see how the stem has been chewed on right there? That's to break the vessels inside the leaf so that when he bites into the leaf, he doesn't get this gooey, wet stuff in his face, because he is going to take the chemistry from this leaf and store it in his body. That's part of his defenses. And he's very, as you can see, he's very, very not hidden. But he cuts the leaf at the base before he eats the leaf. So the leaf has been eaten here, but he cut it off there to break the vessels so that he doesn't get a gush of this stuff in his face. Here is when he was a young caterpillar. I'm underneath the leaf, looking up through the leaf, and this is his shadow here, silhouette, coming through the leaf from above. And you see the row of little dots? That's when it first came out of the egg. It went out here and cut all these little vessels all the way around here to make this piece of the leaf have a very reduced amount of latex. So as he ate this, he got the cardiac glycosides and grew up with them, but not a faceful. Now, this is a fig tree. You could do this with a fig tree right here in Philadelphia, or you could do it in Nigeria, or you could do it in Brazil. Doesn't matter where you are. There's two ways you can relate to this. When you're in the grocery store, go to the meat tenderizer bottles. Pick up the meat tenderizer bottle, read the little fine print on the back side, and you'll find these two words, ficin or papain, on the bottle. That's a digestive enzyme that's in this latex coming out of a wounded fig tree stem. Now, what the indigenous grandmother knew was, she steps out of her tent or her house, and she looks down, and here's this 2-year-old kid with a very distended belly. So what does she do? She gets her knife, a spoon, she goes over to a fig tree, cuts the fig tree, drips a spoonful of this white latex into the spoon, catches the kid, holds his mouth open, and sticks a spoonful of this latex in the mouth of the kid. 24 hours later, the kid shits a kilo of parasitic worms that were in the gut of this kid. And the reason why that works is because these two enzymes here, ficin and papain, were evolutionarily designed to deter herbivores. So the nematodes in your gut are not evolved to handle them, because the nematodes in your gut are already evolved to handle your digestive enzymes. So when you have a 4-inch long nematode in your intestine, as I have had many times in the tropics, it's not bothered by my own enzymes. But if I go ahead and feed it this, and a day later, all of a sudden, you got a whole lot of dead parasites in your gut, and you shit them all out. Now, what I learned when I was a graduate student was, after working in Mexico for many months, that I knew I and my son were full of these parasites. Well, we were very hungry for U.S. kinds of food. We came across the Texas border, went into a supermarket, and bought a couple of gallons of milk and several kilos of black Oreo cookies. And as we drove, we sat there in the car and drank this milk and ate the Oreo cookies. The next day, we both dumped all our parasites, meaning that the commercial process had put in as preservatives to those foods, the milk and the cookies, the same kinds of chemicals that knock out parasites in the wild world that you see here. Now, I don't know what those particular chemicals were, but they had exactly the same effect that the wild bison and papain do. Bison comes from figs, papain comes from papaya trees. And here it is there. Another one of these latexes that you know is rubber. This is a rubber plantation right here. And if we go look at the base of the tree, you can see that it's been sliced. The bark has been cut all the way around here. That required a person to realize that if you just went to the tree and just cut into it to drain the sap out, the tree would die. So they invented a special knife that only cuts about 1/4 inch deep in the bark and goes around this like this with that knife, cuts this stripe here. This latex runs out and runs down through here, drips off into this cup. After about 2 days, this no longer is draining and there's no more coming out. The plant itself cuts off the vessels. So they take that knife and cut another slice just underneath it, which is why you see all these lines running up the surface of the trunk. So by the time the tree has gotten all the way down to here, this up here is, and the top is regenerated enough so that it can start over again. So the rubber tree can be harvested over and over and over. Now this is a mechanical defense in the sense that it doesn't have toxins in it, but it's gooey, like think liquid chewing gum. And so you collect gallons and gallons and gallons of this and you process it over a fire and you get raw rubber. Now today you deal with synthetic rubber, but there are special uses just for raw rubber because it's especially elastic and they still harvest it for that purpose. So going back to conservation, this was a rainforest. It is no longer. This is Malaya. This was a rainforest, is no longer a rainforest, and it will never be a rainforest again. This is a crop, just like corn or wheat or rice is a crop. Now here's one that you all have known and you've all tasted in its synthetic form. There's a tree right here that I just cut through with a chainsaw. So now we go and look at the end of that tree. And you can see this white latex dripping from the vessels that I cut with a chainsaw. Now, the common name for this tree is chicle. Where have you seen that name before? In World War II, somebody realized that you could take this latex from the chicle tree, which does not have toxins in it, but it's liquid, gooey. Take that latex, add sugar, heat it a little bit to congeal it, and make chewing gum out of it to give the soldiers so they can chew and get a steady dribble of sugar into their throat while they're doing other kinds of stressful things. So it's like a coffee bean, except it's sugar instead of caffeine. That's the invention of chewing gum. And that's why the brand is Chiclets. It's from these harvested trees in Central America, who still have the scars on them from the harvesting done during World War II. Now here's another one that you've all seen before. This is a fruit about 2 inches across like that. I've removed the interior of the fruit. So this is the hard out shell on the outside. And right here is where an insect punctured the fruit when it was developing. The fruit responded to this damage by secreting a resin, which you see the bubble of it right here. So the penetration broke the resin vessels in the fruit wall, and then they filled up and made a bubble like this. That falls on the ground, fossilizes 40 million years ago, and you call it amber today. There is a piece of amber, a jewel amber, from a 40-million-year-old Hymenaea cubrale tree, from Central American forest. And it was liquid when it bubbled out. And this small bee got stuck in the liquid. And the whole thing is fossilized. So now it's hard as a rock, of course. So you call it a jewel. Well, you see this in a jewelry store, mounted with other kinds of things around it. But that thing there is, in fact, just the defenses of the tree against invasion through its bark and through the fruits. This is from my high school days. This is a Egyptian mummy. This is the stomach cavity. You can see the ribs the backbone is running right here. The ribs are cut through here. The pelvis is here. And you see this shiny thing here. It looks like water. It's not. It's very, very hard, like shellac or varnish. And that is the embalming process used by, in this case, Egyptians, in embalming. So you take the gut contents out of the cadaver, and then you line the inside with these three chemicals, all three of which you've all heard of somewhere along the line. And these are all excretions from desert plants in North Africa. And so the frankincense was made it smell good. But the balsam and the myrrh were preservatives, and basically resin, especially the balsam, was resin to basically seal this tissue away from water, away from bacteria, away from drying, from getting moist from the vapor in the air, and drying it down to being just like a piece of dry leather. But that's what embalming is. It's just soaking it with plant-based chemicals. One you all know extremely well is this. That's simply the skin of a cow soaked in tannin. Now, the fancy word for tannins is a polyphenol. It's a very, very simple compound chain stuck together in a long chain. And this long chain binds to a protein. So bacteria cannot get to that protein to do their own digestion. So when you tan something, as in tanning a piece of leather, what you're really doing is just soaking the raw protein in a soup of tannins. You can make your own soup of tannins if you like. You just go out and pick an oak tree. Oak tree bark has got the bark itself, the dry, dead bark on the outside. It's got a high concentration of tannins because that's part of the protection of the oak tree. Go to the oak tree, scrape it off into, a couple of handfuls into a pot. Add water so that you're dealing with a kind of a thick soup, and just boil it. So boil it for a couple hours so that what you've basically done is made tea out of the tannin. Because when you do a cup of tea, the brown color in the tea is tannin. And that's why people drink milk with tea. Because if they didn't, the tannins in the tea would bind to the proteins in their own mouth and their own teeth to turn the inside of your mouth brown and stop part of your digestive process. So what they do is put milk in there. Well, what you're going to do, or you can do, you see a dead squirrel on the road, stop safely with your car somewhere, cut off a piece of the skin, take the skin, and soak it in this cup of tannin soup that you have made from the oak bark. And what you've done is what people have been doing for thousands of years to make leather. Leather that does not degrade, does not decay. And that's all this is right here, is a piece of cow skin that has been soaked in tannins, and the old original source of those tannins in Europe was the bark of oak trees. In the New World, often it was the bark of mangrove trees, a tree that goes very commonly on the coasts of the New World. And those are even harvested by boats in the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and taken all the way around the bottom end of South America to Europe to tan more cow hides, to make more leather. Now, this horse is eating these green bananas. Now, you take a green banana and try to eat it and see what happens. What happens is you find that inside it's full of a liquid that makes your whole mouth pucker up and binds to the saliva in your mouth and the walls of your mouth. The horse does the same thing. Those are tannins that have not yet been bound by the fruit. So there's still the defense for the green banana. The horse eats them. So why isn't the horse bothered by all this tannin in his mouth? It swallows the whole thing and has got special enzymes in its gut, run by the microbes in the horse's gut, who split the tannins off of the protein in its own saliva. That protein is recycled back up into the mouth, and the process goes over again. And in the process, they got the proteins that were in the green banana. This is a persimmon from the street in New York, and sweet, good, like it is. But if you see a wild persimmon tree, right there on campus, there's some at the cemetery that are just to the west side of campus. You see these persimmons on the ground. When they're in the tree, they're impossible to eat because they're very rich in tannins. But when the first frost hits in the fall, they fall off, and suddenly all kinds of animals, raccoons and foxes and birds, are eating them. Why? Because the tannins inside the vacuoles and the cells were released by that frost and bound onto the tissue in the cells. So then they don't bind on the gut of the fox or the raccoon or the bird. Domestic ones have been bred so they don't have to do that. So you can buy your own persimmons, sweet and good, on the streets in New York or Chicago or wherever. Now, when you look at a tree, it's a big tree here, and I've just cut a slice into it with an axe. Right here are the resins coming out from just under the bark. That's part of the protection of the tree from boring beetles. Then there's this pale stuff that you see here. That's the living tree still. And that's where the tree stores its starch, sugars, proteins, water, all that stuff. That's the fat body of the tree. And then there's this dark stuff in the middle. That is stone dead. Absolutely dead. And what the tree has done has gradually filled those cells with toxic chemicals. So it can't be degraded by anybody, a fungus, termite, anything, leaving the center of the tree rock hard, major support. So as the tree gets bigger and bigger in diameter, what happens is this piece here expands outward into here, and the sapwood here makes more of it. So this continues out, and finally this resin vessels are out here on the edge, just under the living bark. So if you look at a cross-section through a tree, this is in Michigan, and this piece right here is the dead piece. The storage is this piece right here. The bark is right here where the resin glands are here, but you see where the flies are? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 flies. They're feeding on the edge of this. That's where the goodies are. Here there's nothing for them. But the sugars and the water and the starch are all right here on this edge. Now, this is a piece of a tree from Central Africa, and you've all seen it before. Every one of you have seen this tree. This is the heartwood of a persimmon tree. This is the sapwood of that same persimmon tree, and the outer piece has been stripped off. What is this black here? It's what you call ebony. Otherwise, what you call the black keys on a piano. The black keys on a piano are made of ebony, the center of a persimmon tree. And of course, the white keys are made from ivory. The idea being having something that can take a lot of abrasion, a lot of pounding without altering, without changing. Here is a wild tree, I don't know its name, here near our house, where the heartwood has persisted and survived. This is it's yellow in this case instead of black, but it's full of toxic chemicals and totally dead. This out here, the sapwood, is being rotted off by fungi and by wood-boring beetles and by termites, and pretty soon it'll get to the point where all there's left is the heartwood. See this strip running right down here in the middle? That is the piece that'll fossilize. And the pieces outside of that will just rot away and be eaten by organisms and all that. So the point is, a tree trunk is not just a simple thing. It's a complex of many different kinds of functions for the plant. Now this is crazy because I just told you about the center being toxic. When this tree was growing up, and it was a young tree in these diameters, the tree did not deposit their toxic chemicals. It started depositing chemicals about here. So from here on out, it's full of toxic chemicals. This is the sapwood out here. But this piece from here to about there is toxic. But this is not. Perfectly edible. And this has been eaten out by fungi and termites. Now, how can that be functional for a tree? Because there are exit holes to this inner cavity where a branch breaks off, where a root is rotted away, in different parts of the tree trunk. And animals, bats, rodents, raccoons, porcupines, all kinds of animals, come into that hole and refuge in the hole. And they shit and urinate in there. And that becomes a major source of nitrogen for the growing tree. As its own roots grow into that hole and pick up the nitrogen from that urine and waste material from the animals. So while this is the bane of loggers hate this. It's in fact very functional in the biology of the tree. And there are some species of trees that do this all the time, and other trees never do it. Different species. Now here's one more example of the use of tannins. Mom, little beetle, came along here and laid an egg right there in this leaf. The larva drilled into the leaf and started mining through the leaf. And this is its path. And you can see it's getting thicker, so as it grows. So it grows thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker, all the way around to here, and finally to here, it makes a little house for itself inside the leaf and pupates inside of there, and then the adult beetle cuts a hole in the top and comes out. We start the life cycle all over again. Why is this tunnel marked? Because the tree's response to this beetle mining inside of it was to deposit tannins all around the wall so that the bacteria and fungi associated with the larva could not invade the living leaf tissue. So it's a way of sealing off. It doesn't kill the beetle larva. Well, I mean, evolution went this way. It basically seals off the caterpillar, so the caterpillar is doing a certain amount of damage, but selection hasn't allowed it to actually kill the caterpillar. Now, what we also don't know, of course, is what role the caterpillar, the larva of the beetle, played in the fact that the plant only uses this kind of walling off defense. It might be that this larva of the beetle releases a compound into the leaf that that blocks the other kinds of defenses that this leaf would have to a beetle larva drilling through it. Okay? And I'm emphasizing it. This is mining inside the leaf. It's not on the outside or underside or top side of the leaf. Now, this diagram is a friend of mine in 1978, and he was noticing, as we all were, that you get a plant, and some animal comes along and eats a piece of the plant. Another animal comes along a little later, investigates the plant, and walks away and does not eat it. This was probably first noticed with big mammals. The one case I know very well in Finland was with a moose browsing willows. Those are little shrubby bushes, small trees that live along creek banks, and somebody was studying them for years. And they found that if the moose came along and ate the tops of these little bushy willows, at that time, the moose ate a lot. And then no moose touched that bush for 4 years afterwards. In other words, not only did the plant make a bunch of nasty chemicals to stop the moose from feeding on the plant, which takes obviously a little bit of time, but the new leaves made each year remembered that. So it took 4 years of not being fed on before that plant was again available for an herbivore to feed on. So what Ryan was looking at was what are the signals? What are the hormonal signals for doing this? So here's his sketch. So here's the caterpillar eats this leaf first time before the plant's been touched, and that stimulates a hormone. The hormone goes through the other parts of the plant, and other leaves respond to it by making a defensive compound, in this case a protease inhibitor. A protease inhibitor, as I said earlier, is one of these things that goes into your gut, it binds with the gut walls and with the microbes in your gut and blocks them from doing their digesting. So it would then go ahead, the hormone would be produced, that hormone would go to these other leaves, cause them to make protease inhibitors using the resources from the sun. And so they're then now rich in that. And now along comes another caterpillar a week later, takes a bite out of it, and says, ah, that's not for me. So what you're seeing is that when you look at a plant and somebody tells you that this plant has got nicotine in it, or this plant has got cocaine in it, or this plant has got morphine in it, or it's got caffeine in it, that may be true in the sense of the species has those things in it. But at that particular time you are looking at it, it may not have been subjected to the damage that causes it to create those chemicals, the so-called inducible defenses, as opposed to the standing defenses. And we all understand this from national armies, for example, that they have a standing defense, and then when something goes wrong, they crank up more soldiers, more guns, more tanks, more whatever. And the whole point being that this happens out there in nature all the time. Now, the other side of this coin is that the animal itself may respond to the existence of these hormones in a leaf after it's fed on it a bit by creating its own defensive compounds in response to that. So the animal itself, which can be eating the plant, isn't necessarily just a static object that grinds up and digests plants. Its capacities will change through time depending on what it has been exposed to, both in terms of what the chemistry of the leaves are that it's been feeding on and what kind of condition it's in. Is it starving? Is it not starving? Has it had a full meal yesterday? It had not had a full meal yesterday? And all those kinds of variables. And folks, that's the end of it for today. Now the question becomes, where does the conservation message come in here. I think I've already told you enough as background for a whole lecture we're going to have on this a little bit down the road. But people have been harvesting these chemicals like forever from plants as drugs, as medicines, as flavors, as poisons for people, all this sort of stuff. Well, that became formalized, I think it's fair to say, in about 1978, 1980, 81, 82, a little further along, 85. But it started becoming a bubble up idea with different chemists going out and actively collecting plant material from the tropics that had been used as native medicines, as native drugs for a long, long time. It was very quite known, quite well known to local shamans, to local medical people, to local cultures, people who are understanding of the forest. And an industry began to develop in the United States and Europe of explicitly going to these countries and buying samples or just walking away with samples. And this was going on when I was a graduate student, and we were asked by big pharmacological companies if we would collect samples to bring back to the United States when we went to the tropics and came back. And it was effectively what we call today biopiracy. I didn't ever get involved in that, but my colleagues in Berkeley did. And so I was quite aware of it going on, but didn't think about it at all. And years later, in a meeting in Cornell University with Tom Eisner, a person who's now not with us anymore, in a meeting with him and Merck, the chemical company, Merck Pharmacological Company, the big pharma, as they say, in a meeting there, and they were all discussing various aspects of getting these samples and so on. And I realized that there was a high-level vice president of Merck sitting in the corner just listening. So I walked over to him and I said, why did you guys offer $25 a sample back in the 60s to us when we were graduate students if we would bring back material? And he said, well, that's what the biologists wanted. And I looked at him and I said, are you serious? He said, yes. And I said, price just went up to $1,000. He looked at me and said, okay. That was the beginning of this negotiation. So I'm sitting now here in Costa Rica trying to think about how to support biodiversity research and biodiversity conservation in Costa Rica. So I said back to them, look, you're a huge company. And if there was another huge company that had a great big greenhouse and you wanted to go in their greenhouse and do biodiversity prospecting for your interest in chemicals in the plants in their greenhouse, you know perfectly well that when you walk through the front door of their greenhouse, you would be confronted with a contract from that other company to share the results from this exploration. And they said, well, yes. And I said, well, will you let us have two of your very, very expensive, very good lawyers to work on our team, and we will act like Costa Rica is that greenhouse. And we will work with you to come up with a contract that you are happy with, but that the Costa Rican government is happy with also. And it took us about 1.5 years to develop that contract. But that was the first biodiversity prospecting contract in the world that we know about as a formal contract. And what it did was begin to set the stage for the concept of a country is effectively a big, large greenhouse. And it pays lots of money, lots of administration, lots of time, lots of human resources to protect and maintain that greenhouse. So why not have it go to work being a partner with real respectable business, just like any big company can be a respectable partner with another big respectable business. And we will now talk more about that process in a later lecture. But I thought I would use the few minutes we have here extra to point out this. And what, of course, the idea was is that these funds that flow from this kind of biodiversity prospecting would serve two functions, not one, two. One is that the funds themselves could be used as part of the funding for the cost of maintaining wild and tropical conservation. And the second one is that a country itself would come to value a conserved large wild area because of the potential things it could contain, just like it values croplands because of the conventional things that it will obtain. Now, with croplands, regular croplands in the agricultural landscape, we all kind of know what those are, you know, cotton and rice and sugarcane and orange trees and the usual commercial crops. So it's not a big stretch to make a guess as to how they can play out. But with the wild areas, obviously, it takes a lot more development of those wild resources, which you don't know hardly anything about, and of which there are tens of thousands of species. So we're going to talk more about that later on, but the relationship of this entire lecture to conservation is why those interesting compounds are out there that we've been using as humans for a very long time, but there's a whole lot more that we could be using as part of human health and human enjoyment and human biomimicry and human engineering and aesthetics and all kinds of things that are just sitting there inside of protected boxes and we're not doing anything with them. So that's the idea of biodiversity prospecting, and as I say, we'll talk about biodiversity prospecting later in detail later on down the road. So at this point, I should turn off. I'm apologizing for the rain outside. I hope that doesn't interfere with my voice, but it's very loud on our tent roof, and there's no way I can get around that. So there we are. That's it for today.